Worked 41 years to build something worth leaving behind. That's not a boast, it's just the truth. 41 years of early mornings and late nights and missed birthdays and one anniversary dinner I had to cancel because the walk-in refrigerator broke and I was the only one who knew the repairman's number by heart. My husband Raymond, God rest him, used to joke that I married the restaurant before I married him. He wasn't entirely wrong, but he understood. That was the thing about Raymond. He always understood. He passed 11 years ago this coming March. Pancreatic cancer. 6 weeks from diagnosis to the end. I didn't have time to fall apart because my daughter needed me and the restaurant needed me, and falling apart is a luxury I've never quite been able to afford. So I kept going. That's what you do. The restaurant is called Hazel's. Raymond named it after my middle name, which I've always hated, but when he suggested it, I didn't have the heart to argue. It's a Southern-style kitchen on the main street of Clover Falls, Tennessee. Not a big town, not a famous one, just the kind of place where people know your name and your usual order and ask after your grandchildren. We seat 64 inside and 20 more on the porch in summer. For 37 years, that place has been the center of my life. My daughter Ivy grew up in that restaurant. She did her homework at table 7, the corner booth with the wobbly leg that we never quite fixed. She learned to count change at the register when she was 9. She told me once, when she was about 14, that she was going to take over Hazel someday and make it into a chain. I remember laughing, not unkindly. Just the way you laugh at something that sounds exactly right. I thought, yes, this girl knows where she comes from. I was wrong about what that knowledge would do to her. Ivy married a man named Grant 6 years ago. I want to be careful about how I describe Grant, because I've had a long time to think about whether the fault lies with him or with what happened when the two of them got together. I'll say this, Grant is the kind of man who has a firm handshake and a way of looking at you while you're talking that makes you feel like he's already 3 sentences ahead, waiting for you to catch up. He's not stupid. Stupidity I could have worked with. He's something more dangerous than stupid. He's clever and he's ambitious. And he decided very early on that my restaurant was an asset, not a legacy. The first few years were fine. More than fine, actually. Ivy still worked the lunch shift on weekdays. She knew every supplier by name, knew which tables needed extra attention, knew that old Mr. Kowalski always wanted his coffee refilled before he asked. I started handing things over gradually. The ordering, the scheduling, the vendor negotiations. I wanted her to learn it the way Raymond and I had learned it, slowly, with calluses. But Grant had other ideas. He came to me in the spring 2 years ago with a proposal. Expansion, he called it. A second location in Nashville, 40 miles north. He'd been talking to investors, he said. He had a business plan. All he needed was for me to co-sign a loan, a significant loan, nearly $400,000. Using Hazel's as collateral. I told him I needed time to think. He told Ivy I was being obstructive. That was the first time I noticed the shift. She stopped dropping by on her days off. She started calling less. When she did call, there was a new, careful quality to her voice, like she was reading from a script Grant had approved. I told myself it was stress. I told myself it was the natural distance that comes when your children build their own lives. I told myself a lot of things that turned out to be wrong. I didn't co-sign the loan. After 3 weeks of thinking and 2 conversations with my accountant, I decided the risk was too high for a business that had taken Raymond and me a lifetime to build. I told Ivy directly, face to face, over coffee at my kitchen table. I explained my reasoning carefully. I told her I loved her and I believed in her, but I couldn't stake Hazel's on a venture I didn't believe was ready. She nodded. She said she understood. She went home and told Grant. After that, things moved in a direction I didn't fully see until it was right in front of my face. Grant began coming into Hazel's more frequently, not to help, he'd never done much of that, but to observe. He started having long conversations with my kitchen manager, a young man named Perry who'd been with me for 4 years and who I trusted completely. He started asking questions about the suppliers, the lease, the equipment. Ivy told me he was learning the business. I told myself that was a good sign. I should mention the lease. The building that houses Hazel's has been owned by my family since 1987. It's mine outright. No mortgage, no lien, nothing. The restaurant operates under a lease arrangement that I structured years ago on the advice of my accountant, primarily for tax purposes. My name is on both sides of that lease, as landlord and, through the LLC, as tenant. It matters. Remember that it matters. The day everything broke open was the Sunday before Thanksgiving. Ivy had organized a family dinner, not at Hazel's, at her house. She and Grant had bought a place the previous year, a new construction on the east side of Clover Falls, with high ceilings and a kitchen that looked like it had been designed by someone who had never actually cooked a meal. I drove over at 2 in the afternoon as she'd asked, bringing a sweet potato casserole and a pecan pie I'd made from scratch the night before. Grant's family was already there when I arrived. His mother Dean, his father Clark, his brother Seth with his wife and 2 kids. I'd met them all before at the wedding and at a few gatherings since. Polite people. Not warm exactly, but polite. Grant had arranged the table, a long rented table, the kind you use for parties, and I noticed immediately that the seating was organized with Grant's family along one side, and an assortment of chairs pushed to the far end. I set my dishes on the kitchen counter and came back to find a seat. The chair I'd chosen, near the middle of the table, next to where I'd assumed Ivy would sit, had a small folded card on it. The card said, "Reserved. Deanan and Clark." I looked around for Ivy. She was across the room talking to Seth's wife. I caught her eye and gestured toward the card. She said something to Grant, who was standing nearby. He came over. He picked up my casserole dish from the counter, my dish, the one I'd brought, and set it on the kitchen island, away from the table. Then he looked at me and said, in a voice loud enough for everyone in that room to hear, "Mom's seating is at the end. We're keeping the center for immediate family." Immediate family. I want you to understand what that moment felt like. I had known this man for 7 years. I had danced at his wedding. I had sat in a hospital waiting room for 11 hours when Ivy had a difficult delivery with their first child. I had given them the down payment for that house, not a loan, a gift, because Ivy asked me and I loved her. And he was standing in my daughter's kitchen, moving my casserole dish, telling me where I was and was not permitted to sit. I looked at Ivy. She was looking at the floor. I walked to the end of the table and sat down. I sat through the grace that Clark said. I sat through the appetizers. I answered questions when people spoke to me directly, and I watched my daughter laugh at something Grant said. And I felt something settle in my chest, not rage, not exactly. Something quieter and colder and more purposeful than rage. At 7:30 I excused myself, said I wasn't feeling well, and drove home. I want to tell you what I did not do, because this is the part that confused some people later. I did not cry. I did not cry. I did not call Ivy to demand an explanation. I did not lie awake composing speeches. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea, sat at my kitchen table where 30 years of decisions had been made, and I thought clearly and carefully about what I actually had the power to do. The answer came to me before the tea was finished: the lease. Grant had been so focused on the loan I wouldn't give him, on the collateral he couldn't access, that he had apparently not thought carefully enough about the structure that was already in place. Hazel sat on my land, the LLC that operated the restaurant, the LLC of which Ivy was now listed as managing member because I had trusted her with that 2 years prior, leased the property from me personally. The lease renewed annually. The current term expired on December 31st. I was within my rights to restructure. I called my attorney the next morning. Her name is Beverly. Not in the file. She's real and she knows her business. And when I explained the situation, she listened without interrupting and then said, "You want to pull the lease renewal?" It wasn't a question. I said yes. She said, "Give me a few days." What we did was legal, careful, and precise. I chose not to renew the lease with the existing LLC on the existing terms. Instead, I restructured the arrangement. I would operate Hazel's directly, under my own name, through a new management structure. The transition period gave the old LLC 60 days. That was the minimum the lease terms allowed, and also, I felt, the appropriate amount of fairness. I also had a quiet conversation with Perry. I told him what was happening, and I offered him a position under the new structure. He didn't hesitate for more than about 4 seconds. Then I waited. The formal notice went out on a Monday. Ivy received it through the attorney's office. I know she called Grant first because Grant called me 40 minutes later before Ivy did. His voice had a quality I hadn't heard from him before. A tight, controlled quality, like someone trying very hard to sound calm. He said there must be a misunderstanding. He said we should sit down and talk. He said the restaurant was Ivy's future, that she'd built her life around it. I said, I know she has. That's why this is so difficult. He said some other things after that which I won't repeat here because they were ugly and they don't deserve the space. Ivy called 20 minutes after Grant hung up. She was crying. She asked me why I was doing this. She said she thought we had an agreement. I told her gently and clearly that we had never had an agreement about anything beyond my willingness to pass the business on when I believed it was ready, and that what happened at Thanksgiving had shown me it was not ready. That she was not ready, because she had sat in that room and looked at the floor while her husband rearranged my place at a table that I, in every meaningful sense, had helped pay for. There was a long silence. Then she said, "This is revenge." I said, "No, honey. This is a boundary." The next few months were the hardest of my life in a particular way, not devastating, not like losing Raymond, but a grinding, daily difficulty. Grant found a commercial attorney. There were letters. There were threatening phone calls I did not take personally because I had Beverly, and Beverly is very good. He threatened to countersue on grounds of interference with business expectation, which Beverly told me was unlikely to succeed, and would cost him more than it cost me. After about 6 weeks, the letters stopped. Ivy and I did not speak for just over 2 months. I thought about her every day. I drove past her house twice just to make sure the lights were on and the car was in the driveway, and she was, at minimum, physically all right. I'm her mother. That doesn't stop. What I found out later, from Ivy herself, months down the road when we began rebuilding, was that Grant had already taken out a personal line of credit using their joint assets as collateral, without telling her, to fund preliminary work on the Nashville location. When that fell apart, the creditors came after the joint account. Ivy found out the way people find out these things. A declined card at a grocery store, then a phone call from a bank she'd never heard of. She called me on a Tuesday evening in late February. She said, "Mom, I need to talk to you. Not to Grant, not to his parents, to me." I said, "Come over. I'll make dinner." She came. We sat at the same kitchen table where I'd made every important decision of my adult life. She told me everything. Grant's schemes, the secret debts, the way he'd been slowly positioning her to believe that I was the obstacle between them and the life they deserved. She cried. I held her hand. I told her none of this was her fault, and I meant it, and I also told her kindly that trusting someone completely without questioning what they're asking you to overlook is a choice, and choices have consequences, and consequences are how we learn. She nodded slowly, the way she used to nod at the kitchen table at table 7 when she was working through a math problem. "Did you plan all of this?" she asked me. "When you left Thanksgiving dinner?" I thought about that for a moment. "I plan to protect what Raymond and I built," I said. The rest followed from that. She filed for divorce from Grant the following April. It was not easy and it was not quick, but she had a good attorney and, this time, she called me before she signed anything. Hazel's is still on Main Street in Clover Falls. The porch needs repainting this spring, and I've been meaning to update the menu to add a few things my grandchildren have been requesting, and Perry is talking about bringing on a second sous chef for the summer season. The wobbly leg on table 7 is still wobbly. I've decided to leave it. Some things you keep not because you haven't gotten around to fixing them, but because they're part of the story. Ivy works the Wednesday and Friday lunch shifts now. She knows every supplier by name, knows which tables need extra attention, knows that old Mr. can. Kowalski always wants his coffee refilled before he asks. She's learning it the right way this time. Slowly. With calluses. Last month she came in on her day off just to check on a delivery. She was standing behind the counter going through the invoice when I came out of the back, and for a moment she looked so much like Raymond, that same concentrated, quiet competence, that I had to stop and just look at her. She glanced up and caught me. "What?" she said. "Nothing," I said. "You just look like you know what you're doing." She smiled. Not a performed smile, not a polite one, the real kind that starts in the eyes. "I'm learning," she said. "That's enough for me." After everything, after the Sunday before Thanksgiving and the attorney's letters and the 2 months of silence and the long, slow work of putting something back together once it's been broken, that's enough for me. I built Hazel's to last. It's going to last. And now, I think, so is she. I've been thinking a lot lately about what we teach people by what we allow. Not what we say, not what we intend, what we actually allow, day after day, in the small moments that don't feel like decisions but are. When I drove home from Ivy's house that Sunday evening before Thanksgiving, I wasn't thinking about revenge. I want to be honest about that, because it matters. I was thinking about Raymond. I was thinking about the morning we signed the lease on the building that would become Hazel's, how his hand shook a little from nerves, and he laughed at himself for it. I was thinking about every year since, every supplier relationship built carefully, every staff member treated with dignity, every decision made with the long view in mind. And I was thinking about my daughter at 9 years old, counting change at the register with her tongue between her teeth in concentration. That little girl had been in that room. She'd been standing right there. And she had looked at the floor. That's the part I had to sit with. Not Grant. Grant had shown me exactly who he was the moment he picked up my casserole dish and moved it without asking. People show you. You just have to be willing to see it. The harder question was about Ivy. About what I had let grow without naming it. About the ways I had told myself that distance was normal, that deference was love, that staying quiet was the same as keeping peace. It wasn't. Staying quiet was just staying quiet. And silence, held long enough, starts to look like permission. What I did with the lease was not a punishment. I've thought about this carefully, and I believe that's true. It was the natural result of a set of choices. Grant's choices, yes, but also choices Ivy made, and choices I made, stretched out over years. When you build something real and you hand part of it to someone who hasn't yet learned to hold it carefully, something eventually breaks. The question is only what and when, and whether the breaking teaches anything worth learning. Ivy learned. That matters more to me than anything else in this story. She didn't learn because I was cruel. She learned because consequences arrived, the way they always do when you've been ignoring them long enough. Grant's debts caught up with him. The credit line he'd taken out in secret, the Nashville plans he'd built on a foundation he didn't actually own, all of it collapsed under its own weight. I didn't need to do anything dramatic. I just needed to stop holding the structure up for him. There's something I want to say to anyone listening who recognizes something in the story. Not advice, exactly. Just an observation from 60-some years of watching how things tend to go. The people who take without accounting for it, who assume that generosity is permanent, that love means unlimited access, that loyalty is owed rather than earned, those people almost always face a reckoning. Not because the universe is keeping score in any mystical sense. Simply because reality is not actually optional. What you don't earn, you can't sustain. What you don't respect, you eventually lose. That's not philosophy. That's just how things work. And the people who give without limits, who confuse being needed with being valued, who let silence pass for agreement because confrontation feels unkind, those people face a reckoning too. A quieter one. The kind that happens on a drive home when you realize you've been slowly moved to the end of a table you helped build. The way back from that is not revenge. It's clarity. It's looking at what's true and deciding to act on it, steadily, without drama, with the same patience you used to build the thing in the first place. Ivy works Wednesdays and Fridays now. She knows the suppliers. She knows Mr. Kowalski's coffee. She's learning with calluses, the right way, the only way anything real gets learned. That table 7 still wobbles. I'm leaving it. Some things are part of the story.